Well, it's time to get back to talking about stuff that not a lot of people cared enough about. And since I do like a bit of riffing and doing like long winded projects, I thought why not make one without a set schedule, of course, and name it after my favorite movie of all time. So, this is it. This is the first episode, and I wholeheartedly welcome you to the good, the bad, and the interesting. The older members of the channel do remember that in the first series I did on this channel, Born in Quarantine, I had a mascot called the Batman mug. I still do have that, it's in the cupboard, but I didn't want to bring him out for the new show. I want it to be like with a clean slate, so I have this. It was a gift to me, it's a thermos, and if you click it on top, it tells you the temperature of the drink inside. And I don't know if you can see that. I will do one at the end of the recording and see how much I've talked by the temperature of my drink. And the drink itself is blueberry syrup and water. So basically just uncarbonated soda. To be perfectly honest, I had the idea for this show and this same exact topic that you can see in the video title back in the April of 2021, around the time that the show was cancelled. Oh, yeah, the show I'm going to talk about is cancelled, but we'll get to that later. And I actually binged the first season and the second season before binging the third one because I wanted to see what came before, sort of remind myself, and see how this third season ended up being, well, cancel worthy, for the lack of a better word. But then I had this ingenious idea. What if I read the book first? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the idea that was ready to be filmed back in April got pushed into June and then July. This is my copy of the book. As you can see, I bought it after the show was announced and made because it has like now a TV series on Amazon Video. And I read this, and we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. I don't know why am I showing this. Am I showing off? Not really. Just wanted to show my copy, I guess. It's not even very well made. It's already bursting at the seams. In my defense, I'm not a slow reader. It's just that I tend not to go back to the books that I've read before and finish them cover to cover, like the whole thing. I just go to the parts that I really like and reread them, which is great because it gives me a false memory of the book's actual quality and also makes me feel smart because I'm reading smartly rather than hardly. Does that joke make sense? I don't know. And I actually do love American Gods, the book. But part of that love is because I skip the parts that bore me, like Cairo or Lakeside. And I do get to that a bit later in the video as well, but going through them, it made me stall and I procrastinated a lot. The good news is I have fully fleshed out outlines for like the next 10 videos in the series. The bad news is it put me in a mental state where the act of finishing the book became daunting. I know I'm making a big deal out of reading a book that I've also read before and I should have finished sooner, but in order to realize how daunting it was, you need to be in my brain in the time span of April to July of 2021. I mean, for God's sake, COVID is still a big deal here. I'm not vaccinated. There's not enough vaccines to go around. You know what? Screw it. I'm bringing back Born in Quarantine. This is now Raised in Quarantine. And I'm even going to destroy the script that I wrote. Delete. Good riddance. That bit was also scripted. And even though I love referencing Born in Quarantine, and for those of you who don't know what that is, do check them out. And, you know, I do like referencing it with a show called Raised in Quarantine, but I think, you know, Sergio Leone's 1966 masterpiece just triumphs overall. So, yeah, the show will keep its name fully. So, also, before I get to why I read the book and why it was ultimately a futile attempt, I first need to talk about my philosophy on adaptation. Adaptation, besides being an amazing movie written by Charlie Kaufman, directed by Spike Jonze, that every film student wants to nod along and secretly wish that we all could see the movie that Charlie's brother is working on, because that's an amazing movie, and I mean, I would really love to see that somebody make that. Is a subject that, despite being a huge part of the world of art, especially performing arts, is still heatedly debated over among theoreticians. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. I literally listened to that, but theoreticians. There are people who study theory and do theory stuff. There are many schools of thoughts when it comes to adaptation, and more importantly, how it should be critiqued. Are the problems of the adapted piece of art valid if all they did was remain faithful to the original source material and didn't take it as an opportunity to make it better, out of maybe sheer respect for the work of art or even the retribution from the fandom? On the other hand, is it fair to look at an adapted piece of art and consider it flawed just because it does deviate from the original source material and give the story a new perspective? Whichever of these school of thoughts you adapt, and pun very intended, is basically how you look at a piece of art. It has to do with your personal philosophies, your thoughts, how you were brought up, all of that. And here is my read on this subject. This is probably a little bit boring, so if you do want to skip it and get to the show, you can go to this time code, and there I start to break down the show season by season. But I think it's important to see where I come from in regards to adaptation when it comes to a show where the source material is such a huge part of it. I'm sorry I keep looking at the script. I've memorized it, but my memory is not the best. Now, here is my belief when it comes to adaptation, and what I try to consciously remind myself when I'm facing a piece of art that is adapted from another source material. When a story or a work of art has been adapted from one medium to another, it effectively has created something new enough that is seemingly unfair to compare it to the original source that resides in a whole other medium. In simpler forms, and me not trying to be an asshole and reading off my cheat sheet here, when you adapt a story from a book to a movie, the change made from the medium of written text to motion picture is drastic enough that you've basically created a whole new story, or at the very, very least, a new version of that story. The same can be said for all the other mediums, like video games to books, books to video games, comic books to TV shows, movies to comic books. So you get the idea. This is why I tend to go harder on reboots and remakes in contrast to adapted pieces of work, because they are not changing the medium, it's the same medium, so the comparisons feel more justified. And yes, fuck Lion King 2019. I hate it. I despise it. I want to do with it what the original did with Scar. I want to throw it off a cliff and watch as a pack of hyena rip it into shreds, into the bass organs, while Jeremy Irons fucking screams. Anyways, that's my philosophy whenever I go to approach a piece of media that is adapted from another piece of media. That's why I really don't care if a movie like Batman v Superman did a bunch of comic references, because the story in and of itself, it's so shaky that it cannot stand on its own 2 feet without the help of all of this adapted material. And why also I don't care that a movie like James and the Giant Peach changed the source material, because even though I do love the book and I think it's a great masterpiece, it's one of my favorite Roald Dahl's written words, even more than Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. The movie is another medium, and the change is drastic enough that I do think it's a whole other story. I don't see it as James and the Giant Peach on big screen. It's James and the Giant Peach, period. I think, at least in the conversations I've had with people about adapted pieces of work, many people don't really grasp how drastic the change is from prose to motion picture. It's huge. Not only you don't have a lot of the tools in your arsenal that a writer has, like in a monologue that doesn't stick out like a voiceover.
And God help you if you use voiceover in your work, my friends. God help you. It's flaccid, sloppy writing.
You need to take into account how to visualize a feeling that could be going on in a book for pages on end in just a few short seconds. In very patronizing words, the failure of Artemis Fowl, the movie, wasn't that it deviated from the original source material, because I've heard a lot of, at least in my circle of friends, people compare it like, oh, they changed the book, so that's why it's bad. No, it's because the movie didn't have a good story in and of itself. The deviations weren't the problem, the story of the movie was. So that's why my decision to read American Gods, the book, was ultimately pointless, because I'm not going to use the book as a frame of reference for my analysis of the show and its flaws or its strengths. At the same time, though, I'm human, despite what you've heard, and I love speculation. I think that's why a lot of people tend to get really mad when their favorite comic books or books are given a worse treatment at the adapted material, because we love speculation. We love to think what could have been, maybe even using the show that we got or the movie that we got and see their strengths and say, oh, if those strengths were given to the strengths of the original source material, it would have been great. I don't really love that outlook, because I don't think it's fair to the work of art that I'm watching. But at the same time, I'd be lying if I said I didn't sat and daydream for hours about how I would do this particular IP or that particular IP justice if I were to make a movie. So stay tuned for my 2-hour movie based on Don Quixote, because for God's sakes, we still don't have a good adaptation of this book. Make it, people. Stop remaking West Side Story and make Don Quixote. Cast Peter Capaldi as Don Quixote. And then later realize, oh, he's not Spanish. And then you cast Antonio Banderas as Don Quixote. But then a lot of people, Capaldi fans, including myself, will get mad because, oh my God, we could have just imagined Peter Capaldi being Don Quixote. But then Antonio Banderas does such a good job that all of us, we just say, oh, we don't care. It's just, he's the Don Quixote from now on. Just let him have Don Quixote. He's the best Don Quixote we've ever had, because Antonio Banderas is a really good actor. And then you can even have Capaldi appear as like a smaller role, maybe the priest, or if you want to mention Cervantes, like in Man of La Mancha, you can make him be like the Spanish Inquisition, and he can even have a Monty Python reference and say, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Like, how great would be that? So going through the book, and comparing it to the show and seeing the strengths of the show and thinking, well, what could have happened if they did that, but just for the whole book, is kind of fun. And even if ultimately in my own head I don't consider it valid criticism and just look at it as wishful thinking, I'm also not in the camp of the people who say just a general blanket statement, books better than movies, because I think that's ridiculous. There are two different mediums. Just because a story is told great in prose doesn't mean that all of the stories would be told great in prose. I challenge every writer who believes in this notion, and I know there are a ton of them, to write a scene that is as heart-wrenching as seeing the gang of children saying goodbye to Noodles as he goes to jail in Once Upon a Time in America. And yes, I know that movie is based on a book. It's just a big circle, people. Stop comparing different mediums to each other and expect them to fit. With that said, though, let's talk about the show. And I do try not to bring up the book too much. Maybe I just speculate a little about what could have been or what went wrong just looking at the book. And that's not foreshadowing, by the way. I don't know. I'm debating it with myself as I'm saying these words. Even when I've written the script, I still don't know what I will do. The show American Gods was announced in 2014 to be developed by Bryan Fuller, who was known at that point for creating the show Hannibal, which I'm not getting into for this video. It deserves its own discussion. And Michael Green, who was at the time a prominent writer, and by the time the show had come out would have penned one of the best comic book movies of all time, Logan, with James Mangold and Scott Frank, of course. This wasn't the first attempt to bringing American Gods to TV, though. HBO wanted to do it as far back as 2011. But this attempt actually went forward, and 2017, the first season of American Gods was premiered on Starz. Now, I do have my own problems with Starz, the channel as a whole, but I also don't like when people generalize stuff into like, this channel, all that it makes is bad, and this channel, all that it makes is good. HBO made Hello Ladies, and Starz made Boss. What I'm saying is, what channel it's on, especially nowadays, is not really an issue. It could have had the same journey on HBO. I have to be honest, at the time that the show was premiered, I had no idea what American Gods was. My understanding of Neil Gaiman at the time was Coraline, The Sandman, and the fact that he botched Beowulf. The thing that got me interested in the show, like many other shows that I watch, was the cast. Fuller and Green weren't that huge draws for me, but the cast was what I looked at and went, ah. I mean, people like Ian McShane, Peter Stormare, Crispin Glover, and Gillian Anderson. I mean, that Now that could be interesting. Now I'm saying all of this and opening a door of criticism to my own critics of the show because, well, I think all the people that piqued my interest initially all did very, very well. Am I biased? Yes and no. I mean, Peter Stormare could sleep on the set, and I still call it the best performance ever made by any human being ever. But what he brings to the show isn't just himself. It becomes more clearer as we go on. I watched the first season as it was coming out. I had a group of friends at the time who were really into Neil Gaiman, and one of them gave me his copy of American Gods. It wasn't this. It didn't have the picture of the show on it. And I started to read it and was hoping to read it before the first season was finished. But god damn it, Cairo is so boring. Oh, Cairo is second season though. I should keep that. I should keep that for them. The point is, I didn't know what American Gods was or what I was getting into when I was watching the show. I saw the pilot and I thought it was okay. It wasn't the best show ever made, and it had a ton of gimmicks that became annoying quite fast. This is a tangent or rant or whichever suits your interests better. I hate how the first season of American Gods looks. It's something that happens in a ton of shows that want to appear more important than they really are, the camera and everything. It's gone to the extent that I remember the shows that are not as good, but they don't do the camera and insert and close-up gimmicks just because they look different. When I remember City on a Hill, shout out to Kevin Bacon, who's actually really good in it, more than I remember most of the first season of The American Gods, you know you've done something wrong. The useless close-ups and insert shots, the dirty color palette that makes the show look more murky than stylized, and a clear lack of vision is what makes the first season of American Gods appear incredibly drab and boring when put next to the other shows that were coming in the late 2010s. Did you notice I said the first season? Now that's what we call foreshadowing. So what's the story? Sadly, I can't really get into it without some major spoilers, but both in terms of the show and the book, I don't think it really matters because the destination and the twists are not as important as the journey itself. But consider this your warning that the video from this point going on will spoil parts of the show, whole of the show actually, and a huge chunk of the book. So in the first season of American Gods, we get introduced to Shadow Moon. Yes, that's actually his name. He gets released from prison a couple of days early because his wife has been killed in a roadside accident. In the flight to his home, he meets a peculiar gentleman by the name of Mr. Wednesday. Hilarity ensues, and he begins working as Mr. Wednesday's man. More hilarity ensues. In the way we meet a colorful cast of characters like Matt Sweeney, who proclaims he's a leprechaun, a guy by the name of Mr. Nancy, and another guy by the name of Chernobog, who wants to bash Shadow's head in with his hammer because he lost to him in a game of checkers. By the end of the season, in the mansion of a woman by the name of Easter, we learn that Mr. Wednesday is in fact the old Norse god Odin, and there is going to be a battle between the gods of old and gods of new. Oh, we'll get to the new gods. Okay, so that was a piss poor explanation of the first season of American Gods, but I left out a lot of intricacies that I want to dive deeper in. Now, the concept of American Gods, both the show and the book, is very, very interesting. In both the book form and the show form, the fact that these immigrants came to America, the new land, the land of opportunities, and with them came these gods and monsters and mythical creatures who people had a belief in, and they continue to live on based upon that belief that the people held for them, is very intriguing. For someone like me who enjoys mythology quite a lot, it's like finally someone found a way to look at these old stories with a new perspective. And that's why American Gods is actually my favorite Neil Gaiman novel. And that's why, despite the show really getting on my nerve, I still tuned in weekly to watch it. Because I can't tolerate some poorly written dialogue, one hell of a bad performance, and a ton of camera gimmicks, if it means that by the end of it, I get to witness Ian McShane being the best portrayal of Odin ever put to film. Now, this is where I can look at the book and the show and see how they differentiate themselves. But this is not Cinefix, and I'm not a hipster, so I'm not going to do it like line by line. So instead, I want to talk about how the show approaches the subject of mythical creatures in a human world, in a mortal world. The show looks at these mythical creatures, mythical entities, as more human than myth. They talk more human, they have more human interests, and they lack the melancholy feel that specially resides in Norse mythology, which Neil Gaiman, appropriately I might add, translated into the novel. Characters talk like they are human, or at the journey picked up a lot of humanity. It's something that honestly I think works really good for the show. Don't get me wrong, I do like what Gaiman did with these characters in the book and how it feels. But I think the show, in its effort to create a more human outlook into these mythical entities, wasn't misguided. In fact, it was a deliberate and very well done effort to give a more sense of relatability.
Everything looks great.
Meat will be tough, potatoes will be soft. I'm not a good cook. When I was young, there were servants to make meals. Here, there are no servants. There's only us, and learning is beneath me.
I used to be really into mythology when I was a child, and this is like 15 years ago at this point, and I did a lot of readings and a lot of research, and I noticed something. I want to talk about the Greek mythology, the Norse mythology, and the Egyptian mythology, or as the enlightened monk you will call it, the Age of Mythology. Okay, jokes aside, Greek mythology to me has always appeared more human. The gods and the goddesses and the creatures are very vague and flawed. Reading Greek mythology is a lot like watching a soap opera. People hold grudges, they get obsessed with small details, and they make the mortal human pay for it. They are genuinely awful people who for some reason have reign over mankind. I mean, one of the main gods of the pantheon, one of the big guys, doesn't have a seat in Olympus. I mean, can you imagine the story possibilities that can come out of that? The pettiness of it. I mean, god damn, that's good. I think that's why a lot of people, especially in the circles that I've talked to about mythology, tend to get started with the infatuation with mythology through the Greeks. It's easy to get into because you feel the same things that these supposed gods do. And aside from that, it's really easy to comprehend. Who is Poseidon? Beside the coolest god ever, he's the ruler of the seas. How does he rule over the seas? With his trident. That is the manifestation of how he controls the waves. What does his rule consist of? Everything that happens in the seas is the will of Poseidon, from storms that can break boats in half to when a fisherman pulls a net full of fish out of water. and for some reason earthquakes and horses. It's easy to comprehend. Now compare that to Norse mythology. The stories tend to not get as easily understandable, they become more melancholy and more seated in abstract. Even the concepts that have become more famous or infamous, like Ragnarok, they become so muddled in these abstractions that it's really not easy to understand it without doing a deep dive into the lore of the Norse mythology and just what stories came before it. The domains and the roles of these gods and heroes tend to become more complex as well. Thor is the god of thunders, but at the same time he has an abstract role as the guardian of Asgard, and doesn't seem to have any reign over mankind or get any sense of gratification from their actions. Comparing Thor with its Greek equivalent, which in my eyes is Ares and not Zeus, brings out the differences even more. Ares is the god of war. He protects Olympus and gets his power from the battle. So when you attribute your victory or bloodshed to Ares, he gets his bounty and gratification and grants you power in your battle. Thor, although, protects Asgard, but not ruling over any realm of man. In Norse mythology, gods are more like guides or ideas rather than the direct manifestation of their domain. So it becomes infinitely more complex to try to grasp them and bring them into the mortal world. Egyptian mythology, on the other hand, was only mentioned because of that Age of Mythology joke. I'm sorry. Middle Eastern mythologies are, in my idea, very incredible in how epic they are in every instances of their lives. But at the same time, they are just incredibly complex. They are basically non-narrative ideas living outside of time and space, and they become more spiritual rather than literal, which can come off as really boring if you're not ready for it and you're not seeking it. And I think for the purposes of this video, it's better if we stick with literal, because that's how American Gods treats them. I have to also mention this because it does become more relevant as the video goes on, but my understanding and knowledge of the African mythology, aside from Egypt, India, and Native American mythology, is very low. It's a subject that needs a lot of resources and a lot of passion, and it's something that I sadly lack, so I won't be mentioning them as much as I can mention other mythologies. So coming back to Norse and Greek mythology, one of the reasons I think Greek mythology is not going to go out of style in terms of modernization is because of how human it is. You can look at these gods a million ways and bring them in touch with the human world. This is not as easy when you look at Norse mythology, so you can have Percy Jackson using Greek mythology, because it's easy to see these Greek gods evolving as the human cultures and human technology has evolved. It doesn't really work with Norse though. Or does it? That's yet another interesting part of American gods. What would happen to these big abstract ideas and creatures when they have to come down and occupy the human dominion? When they have to come to a new world? I want to mention something in the first season. As I said, the show does treat the gods in a more human way, and I think that works. The best one, who is easily understandable though, is Vulcan, or as we purists know him, Hephaestus. Did I mispronounce that? It's in Persian, we call it Hephaestus, but I don't know if it's closer because I've heard him called Hephaestus. So, whichever is correct, I don't know. The book doesn't really have a ton of Greek gods in it, or Roman gods. It tends to focus more on Norse, Slavic, Germanic, African, or Egyptian. Which is okay because Greek mythology already has enough publicity as it is. But the show does bring in Vulcan, and because of who he is, it's a good blueprint for how humanizing gods can work.
I've franchised my faith.
Franchised?
He's the Forge Master. He created weapons for gods, and now he's doing the same for humans. As weapons evolved, he evolved, which is why he's an odds with Wednesday or Odin, because he's way more rooted in traditional views. The same is true for Bilquis, or as we call it in Arabic Persian pronunciation, Bilqis, but she becomes more important in season 3, and I seriously don't know what they were thinking here, so I'll keep this for way down the road. Do I make sense? Like really, do I make sense? I mean, I don't know how much sense I'm making. I'm trying my best to articulate what I like about the show and what the show is doing to these mythical creatures, which I find interesting. And I don't know if I'm successing or failing at that. Anyways, this is where being a mythology nerd really pays off. Chernobog says, "You want my brother," and you get to giggle because he's probably mentioning Belobog. I might have mispronounced that, but it's kind of fun to imagine that Wednesday would want Belobog on his side and not Chernobog, who is more associated with bad luck and doom. In the world of the show, these moments are given enough of an attention, and through visuals and dialogue, it's possible to see the mysticism of these moments and these figures. And honestly, these are some of the best parts of the first season. I think it's a problem, and it's happening in more and more shows nowadays, when the side characters become more intriguing and interesting for us to watch than the main characters. I know by the virtue of them being side characters, they get to not spend as much time in the spotlight and thus remain to have an aura of intrigue and mysticism. But at the same time, I think the main characters should be the emotional core of the show. They are the ones we sort of relate to more than the side characters, and so we should be looking at the main character's journey, and the side characters are the flavoring. But in more and more shows, the side characters become the main course, and the main character is like the water they put in front of you in the restaurant before you order the food. Imagine a show like The Borgias, which is one of my favorite shows of all time. If Cesare and Rodrigo Borgia didn't have the power to keep you intrigued as to what is happening. And well, sadly you get American Gods. Shadow Moon and Laura Moon, his wife, which comes back as a revenant, are the most drab parts of the show. And they are effectively our protagonists. In case of Laura, they are also the most annoying parts of the show.
My lucky coin, Ginger Minge. My husband gave that coin to me.
I really don't want to go on a rant against Emily Browning, but she's really bad in American Gods. And she was really bad in Sucker Punch and a series of unfortunate events. She looks constantly constipated and like she doesn't want to be there. And the feeling is mutual, let me tell you. And having her be such a big part of the show in the first season and even bigger in the second and the third season really makes going through her scenes a drag. I don't blame Emily Browning for all of it because she's really poorly written. Her character is basically the uncouth trait from The Sims Medieval. Does anyone else remember The Sims Medieval? But it also doesn't help that she has played that character without an ounce of charisma. And this is something that I can really praise Ricky Whittle for. Shadow is also very poorly written in the show. He doesn't seem like a character, more like an obsolete observer who doesn't have a thought or motivation in his head. But Ricky Whittle is actually charismatic enough that you go through it with him just to get to the good parts. Oh, I'm out of frame. Just to get to the good parts. I still think the first season of American Gods, the show, with all of its false turns and all of its mistakes, was still something of an achievement. It had an attempt, and even though a lot of the stuff was hit and miss, the good stuff are actually good, and I do tend to go back and look at them every once in a while.
What's the matter? Let her wake up. Let your sister hear this con man, this son of a bitch, come into my home and try to make me die.
Yeah, the gimmicks are bad, but when there is a thematic reason for them, they do actually work. The flashbacks, for example, of how each mythical entity came to America does work with the overworked camera and the murky colors because it is a murky memory. But I think for a show that wanted to do something unique and interesting about mythology and American culture, it is too much in the comfort zone of TV to be effective. And yes, it's weird, but it's not effective when every other show surrounding this show is exactly weird to the very same extent. This is the difference between style and trying to have a style. Breaking Bad has a style. Even though it's a style that is heavily borrowed from the Western genre, it's a style that works well with the themes of the show and the characters and how they're feeling. American Gods, on the other hand, thinks that camera gimmicks and overcorrected grainy colors gives it a style, which it doesn't. It doesn't work with the themes, it doesn't work with the story it wants to tell, so it's nothing, basically. Thankfully, they sort of do redeem it for the second season. And, well, let's talk about that. I just want to mention that it's gone up by like 3... Oh, no, it's still 16. Oh my god, this furnace is amazing. It's still 16 degrees centigrade. And, let's try it. Yep, still cold. This one is going to be a long one, and so I probably will film it in like little increments, which means the camera position will probably change between season to season. So just wanted to give you a heads up that it's not, and I do mean not, a continuity error. It's because it's literally the next day. I probably will change the shirt too, so I can signify that. But yeah, let's talk about the second season. Okay, I'm going to use this makeshift interlude that sort of presented itself when I felt too tired to film in one sitting and talk about the American Gods comic. Mainly because I really don't have much to say and I don't know where else to put it. I didn't know about these comics until very, very recently, as recent as June of 2021, and I got them and I've read the first 2 volumes. From what I can tell, it's a word-by-word adaptation of the book. It doesn't deviate at all and it uses the text of the book almost to a T. And I count that as a detriment towards the comic. On the outside, I don't think it's overtly beautifully drawn, but it gives the images that the book described fairly accurately. Not fairly good, but fairly accurately. I just wanted to mention it for those of you who want an incredibly faithful visual adaptation of the book. So if like me you weren't aware of its presence, it can give you an incentive to check it out. Also, just a heads up, the second half of the video has my hair in a very messy state. I'm sorry for that, but I hope it's not too big of a distraction. Wait, why did I bring it up? Now it's gonna be more of a distraction. Oh, God damn it. So yeah, this is how I'm going to look for the second half. Different shirt. Yeah, second half of the video. We're going to talk about season 2 and season 3. And even though it's not really useful for this application because, well, we know it's going to keep the temperature, but I just wanted to show how we did it. Clinkling you here is actually ice in there today. And I don't know if you can see that, it's, damn, it got lower, it's 10 degrees Celsius, so yeah, real cold drink. But yeah, let's talk about the second season now. There is something that some of you who might have read about the show or have read some reactions to it might be asking. How does the show deal with non-hetero characters and race? Well, these are heavy subjects and we'll get to them, don't worry. There's a point that the show addresses them in a meta sense. It will become clear when we get to them. With that said, you know what is the sign that things might not be going so smoothly? When the showrunner is changed and nobody bats an eye. Jesse Alexander of Heroes fame, the show, replaced Fuller and Green for the second season, and he did a lot of good and a lot of bad. He even had Gaiman himself work with him on the premiere of the second season. He actually managed to clean up a lot of the shoddy work of trying to find a style, but in achieving that, it meant that the second season also had quite a lot more boring parts. I mean, how bad could it be? Let's see what else Jesse Alexander has worked on. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Anyways, the second season, in my opinion, was more coherent than the first season. At the same time, it was more in line with the themes of the story. There were issues though, right out of the bat. Gillian Anderson and Kristen Chenoweth, who played Medea and Esther respectively, both didn't come back for the second season, and the reasoning, the in-universe reasoning for their absence is, well, for the lack of a better word, idiotic.
So Easter told me to tell you she ain't coming. On account of you mowing over bunnies with your car like some kind of fucking rabbit racist.
Yeah, there is a war going on between gods of old and gods of new, and it's going to be of epic proportions. And Easter didn't show up because Wednesday ran over a bunch of bunnies. Yeah. Basically, there were problems with the show. In real world, in our world, not in the universe. And much like any other show ever made, it was going through turmoils. But the problem was, those turmoils were showing themselves in universe. There was a sense of chaos that wasn't really in line with the story. It was like, we don't know what we are doing. At the same time, just mentioning the show would bring up all of these stories, all of this news that people were leaving. And again, the in-universe reasoning for many of these changes weren't done in a good way. So the real-life problems were trying to manifest themselves alongside actors and actresses and showing themselves to the audience, us. But even having that in mind, the scope was suddenly bigger. There was a war coming on, and there needed to be a campaign. Now, I do want to mention this, even though I think it's inconsequential. The paths of the book and the show have diverged completely at this point. There are a lot of characters in the book that don't appear in the show, and vice versa. There are a lot of characters in the show that didn't appear in the book. So I can't even speculate much as what is going on with the show when we regard to the book, because, well, the paths have diverged. But it's my pleasure to announce that both the show and the book managed to fuck up Cairo. It's a chore to get through that part. The show kind of corrects a lot of the cinematic problems of the first season by the time we get to the second season. The color palette isn't as grainy and murky, and the camera isn't zooming in on the actors like it's trying to find all the pores in their skin. And doing that, the show actually manages to find a style. Yes, it's more boring than risque like the first season, but at the same time it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. There is clearly more thought put into how to make a show a more cohesive experience. Now, if only that would happen to Star Trek Discovery. No, I'm not over it. And while we're on that, I'm not over Picard either. Star Trek is dead, and they're parading its corpse like an offering to Chernobog. Only in this case, Chernobog is not even fucking Peter Stormer. Because if it was, honestly, it would be a little bit okay. The old gods of the show now also have a more prominent presence, and honestly, you get to feel that. You get to feel the power and the lack thereof. It's more depressing to see these aging and senile gods, but it doesn't try to be depressing by turning the color correction to 100 while turning the brightness down 100. It just achieves that by writing better dialogue and using camera and lighting in a more meaningful way.
Or maybe he wants what we all want. A tall glass of hops, fermented. By yours truly.
They also do the more fantastical element with more sense of, for the lack of a better word, epicness as well. The summit inside Odin's head is magnificent. It's beautifully done. You feel like something big is going down, and it's going to be epic, and it's going to be loud, and I hope by the next season it doesn't turn into a pathetic parade of three gods walking. Wink, wink, wink. I think one of the best ways to demonstrate this point is to put two scenes next together and compare them. One of the more epic scenes of the first season is the finale, when Wednesday declares himself to be Odin to Shadow and the world.
I am
And one of the more epic scenes in the second season is in the premiere, and it's the summit of the gods inside Wednesday/Odin's head.
Chernobog is with us. He has brought his hammer to the fight. Yeah, when the time is right, my hammer will swing.
In the finale of the first season and the declaration of Wednesday as Odin, you have Ian McShane doing a fantastic job of delivering an epic monologue, while the corresponding imagery sort of reflect that. You have desaturation of color, you have faceless men dancing on the ground, and the clouds in the sky forming the face of Wednesday, Odin. And all of this is happening in the material world. It's an epic scene, it's a well done scene, and it's one of the high points of the first season. The problem is, though, this scene is not in accordance with the rest of the first season. When you put this next to another memorable moment from the first season, which is the introduction of Chernobog, They feel so different that you can almost imagine them being from two very different shows. Now, in the second season, the Summit of the Gods starts with Mr. Nancy. And a shout out to Orlando Jones, who is doing a fantastic job. He was also good in the first season, but in the second season, they focus on him much more, and he's breathtakingly good as Mr. Nancy. Or Anansi. The Summit has a visual distortion. It tries to tie the images of these gods in a mythical sense to the material image that we've been seeing throughout the show. It's not seamless, it's not the best effect out there, but it does work because by then we are not in the material world, we're inside Odin's head, so the distortion as well as the cold atmosphere really does work. It's not as crazy as Wednesday's monologue in the first season, so the effect might be a bit less, but at the same time it doesn't stick out when I put this next to another memorable scene from season 2, which is Brother Can You Spare a Dime scene. It really doesn't feel like a different show, and honestly, it's more coherent and more in line with the themes of the faded gods. Faded here means forgotten, not high. I mean, it probably wouldn't hurt to get high when you're going to a summit. And not that I have though. But there are things that coherency cannot help resolve. Okay. It's time to talk about Cairo, Illinois. As I've mentioned in the book, this part really drags. When I first started reading the book, this is the part that really tested my patience, and I actually dropped the book and went back to finishing it at a later date. And when it was announced that in the second season a character by the name of Mr. Ibis is going to play a much bigger role, I was intrigued to see what the show would do with Cairo. And honestly, it's still such a boring affair. I don't know why they decided to do Cairo like this, but they drag out everything until it becomes like a standstill. Then there is this awful romance subplot, and the rhythm of the show comes down until it feels like a corpse. I mean, pun intended. If you've seen the show, that is a very good joke. I still admire the show for keeping it coherent in the visuals and in the themes, even through these boring parts. But why? Why is Cairo written like this? It's a shame because Mr. Ibis is actually one of the more well-written characters, and it's actually a very good performance, by the way. And if the rhythm wasn't so bad, he could have really shined. I think part of it comes down to what I briefly mentioned about the Egyptian mythology. Okay, this is something where the show and the book mingle together, and not in the prettiest way, but hear me out. Both in the book and the show, Cairo is the place where the Egyptian mythologies reside. Mr. Ibis, who is Thoth, which in and of itself is a hard deity for me to comprehend, takes the center stage. In the book, he has also Mr. Jackal, who is supposed to be Anubis. But in the show, aside from a brief cameo in the first season, Mr. Jackal is nowhere to be seen. The same goes for Horus and Bast, who don't even get a cameo. So mean. These gods, as I mentioned, tend to occupy a more spiritual world than a literal one. It's something of a cultural thing in the Middle East that it has still remained to this day. Some of the remnants of that culture is still present. So the parts in Cairo are clashing with the literal image of the rest of the gods. It's really hard to see Mr. Ibis occupying the same space as Chernobog or Mr. Nancy, because he just seems so out of this material world. I think this is also a good place to talk about Jinn and Salim. By the way, in Arabic, it's not Jinn, it's Jinn, a Jinnah. but since I'm speaking in English and they do call him the Jinn in the show, I'm going to do the same. It's Jinn and Salim, and it's the pronunciation of Salim also bothers me, but again, I'm staying true to the way the show pronounced it. Now, this is where things get interesting in terms of sexual identity and sexual orientation. As I mentioned, part of the American Gods intrigue is putting these mythical creatures into modern world and have them interact with modern ideologies. And sexual orientation and sexual identity is something of a concept that has become more prominent in the modern times. Salim is a character that is shown to be homosexual, and he finds a partner in a jinn or ifrit. There are different things, but the meaning is sort of the same. The book calls him an ifrit, the show specifically says jinn. I'm going to go with jinn. It's a Middle Eastern mythical creature who is more attributed to Islam, because the pre-Islamic version of it is really limited to the Arabic countries, the Saudi Arabia and Iraq and that part of the world. And the Islamic version is more universal. We have them in Iran, we have heard stories of them in Afghanistan, in even northern countries like Turkey and Azerbaijan. And the show does mention the jinns who fought beside the Islamic prophet.
Years later, after the prophet's revelations, we jinn, we were given a choice. Convert to Islam or live our lives as heretic demons. I chose heretic demon.
It's a whole new thing. I'm not gonna get into it, but yeah, he had an army. So these mythical creatures are religious people, and Salim is shown to be a religious person as well. Now, the show doesn't go far into exploring the religious aspect, and I can't really fault them. There are religious imagery like the many Jesuses that were shown in the first season or the jinn itself, but the show really doesn't do much about the Abrahamic God. It just shows him as a deity who doesn't manifest himself and lets these cultural images sort of cultivate themselves and go on. Honestly, the show hasn't put a lot of thought into the Abrahamic God, and I don't blame them. It's a really complex subject. The book completely glosses over it, but the show does try to do something with it. So Salim and Jinn are very interesting because based on the religious texts, their actions are condemned. And part of an arc that Salim goes through, which really manifests itself in the third season, but it's such a small part of that season that I feel good mentioning it now, is finding peace with his sexual orientation and sexual identity and finding sort of a middle ground between what he is and what the Abrahamic God wants from him. In the second season, there is some tension between Salim and Jinn, and I think for the most part the show seems to be working in a good way. It gives the subjects the importance that they need in both a religious context and a social context. And when the excitement over seeing a penis on TV screen is over, I think it's something that can have a good argument and some interesting outcomes. Until Musa Quraish decided to leave the third season and that arc came to an abrupt end. Ooh. Should have saved that for the third season. So the second season for me was an improvement that came at a cost, and the cost could be felt. The show became less risque, but more coherent. The visuals became less creative, but they were more in line with the thematic relations. Now, I was actually looking forward to the show from this point on. I wanted to see more of Wednesday, Chernobog, Nancy. I wanted to see Mr. Ibis come back. I wanted to see all of them interact with each other more. And I mean, I would tolerate Laura and Shadow. Yeah, they didn't get any better in this season. They were the same. But at least they couldn't get worse, could they? Obvious foreshadowing is obvious. Let me take a drink. I first heard of the third season while I was wandering the web and I saw a message by Orlando Jones. He was saying that he was fired from American Gods. Now, imagine my surprise when I heard one of the best parts of the show was being fired. Orlando Jones claimed that the new showrunner, Charles Eglee, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, has fired him because he sends the, quote, wrong message to Black America. This is a visual medium. I don't know why I said quote and did air quote, but if you are listening to this, I did air quotes. Two things here. One of them needs more deliberation and we'll get to that. The second thing, I didn't know there was a new showrunner. What happened to Jesse Alexander? Well, remember I said that it's not a good sign when the showrunner is changed before the season arrives? Well, it's even less of a good sign when the showrunner is changed again. Charles Eglee, of something of fame, I'm sure, and I hope it's not only Terminator Dark Fate, was put in charge of the third season. And that brought something that I will talk about in length later, but let's just say the show's cancellation was seeming more realistic at this point. The first thing that I said needed more deliberation is the matter of race. Now, a couple of things you need to keep in mind. I don't live in America. I think I've mentioned that before. I live halfway across the world, and for me, the matter of race, the question of race, is something that I've been following from afar. So my perspective is not one that I've lived at. But, and secondly, I'm Middle Eastern, and even though I can attest to the way media has portrayed Middle Eastern people, I can't do the same thing about African or African American people. These things are very complex, and I know it turns some people off, but I can't really ignore it anymore. If you don't want to listen to that though, too bad. American Gods is a show about immigrants coming to America and bringing their deities, their gods and mythical creatures with them. So of course race and cultural differences are going to play a huge part in that. The reason I didn't mention it sooner was because I knew sooner or later I need to talk about Orlando Jones being fired, and I knew this was the prime time to talk about this issue. The show has a diverse cast if you've been paying attention to the clips that I've been showing. And it should have. Every race in America has an origin point, whether Irish, African, Middle Eastern, Egyptian, German, Nordic, Slavic, you get the idea. All of these people who had their own cultures and their own beliefs came to America or were brought to America at some point in history in search of something other than what they knew. And when they came, they clashed with a tapestry of culture that was already here. So I think it's part of the genius of American Gods. This is why it can't be British gods or German gods or Japanese gods. Because America in its core is a place where all of these different cultures came together, and with them, their gods came too. Now, it's a historical fact that all of these races and cultures that came to America weren't treated the same. So of course, their gods will have the ideas and the voices of the people that prayed to them. So yeah, race is very important in American Gods, because how America treated these people of different races and different cultures is how those gods will see and perceive America. You can imagine the perspective of gods like Wednesday or Chernobog who came to America as conquerors is not going to be the same perspective as someone like Anansi, who came to America in the memory of literal slaves, or someone like Whiskey Jack, a Native American deity whose people were slaughtered by the people who worshipped Wednesday. For Anansi and Whiskey Jack, I hope I'm not mispronouncing it. I'm going to call it Whiskey Jack because, it's sort of the same. Get the pun? America is not a gorgeous past that they need to remember and go back to. Anansi doesn't perceive the past as this beautiful image because it wasn't for him. He has anger, he has oppression, and he needs to show that. Whiskey Jack is bitter and angry because he lost his people to nothing more than prejudice and a sense of self-worth that put Wednesday on top of him. So Orlando Jones saying that he was fired because his character was sending the quote-unquote wrong message to Black America, above all else tells me that the new showrunner, Charles Eglee, doesn't understand the material that he's supposed to be managing. Now, being fully transparent and fair, a spokesperson for the show said that Orlando Jones' contract wasn't renewed because the parts of the book that they were going to adapt for the third season didn't have Mr. Nancy in them, which, in my opinion, because I don't want to get sued, is complete and utter bullshit. I'll get to the nitty-gritty of it later, but the third season literally has a scene where all the gods appear on the side of Wednesday. And even if he's not in the book, which, spoiler alert, he is, that scene I'm talking about, which in the show has Ibis and Chernobog, in the book it's Mr. Nancy and Chernobog, so it's literally in the book. But even with that, he was in the summit. He was on the side of Wednesday, and there was nothing to mention that he wasn't going to be there. Also, you're basically throwing the book away at this point. I know you're trying to backpedal, and I'll get to that later, but why would we believe that? And even if that was for some reason true, why didn't you renew it for fourth season? I know that unless, they get renewed for the fourth season, they don't know that they're going to have one. But at the same time, you can't tell me that they didn't have a sense of lingering cancellation. You can. There's nothing stopping you. Maybe they didn't, but I'm just saying I call bullshit on the fact that they didn't renew his contract because the parts weren't in the book. I had a joke here which I botched, but I'm going to just say it. Did you know you were going to get cancelled? Gillian Anderson was in American Gods. You know what to do, boys. Cue that X-Files theme. So yeah, I think that was a funny one. So I wanted to mention that joke that I didn't say because I changed something while I was saying them. Anyways, the third season sucked. At this point, American Gods has 3 seasons and each of them is a different show. The first season is a bizarre, confused mess, but ultimately an okay first step. The second season is, in my idea, American Gods, as in American Gods as it should have been. I'm sorry for my voice. And the third season is a rom-com romantic plot with some magic thrown in. It's Bewitched, remade by Ari Aster. That is a joke that doesn't make sense if you think about it, so just laugh and move along. It does make sense if you really think about it, but I need to make a whole other video talking about what routes my brain took to come to that joke. I think I'm not as funny as I think I am. The visual identity of the show is basically gone at this point. We are now watching a run-of-the-mill drama show, and in the lower echelon, considering that, the point the camera at the person who is talking kind of show. even the surreal and magical stuff, which the show has a lot of opportunity to do interesting stuff with, are again very boring and ordinary. I mean, the season doesn't even manage to keep a coherent visual tone and atmosphere in and of itself. And it's much more jarring than the first season because it seems like the last 2 episodes, which change things up a little bit, are a completely different show, and the rest is like a romantic comedy about a guy in a remote town. I mean, Lakeside isn't the most interesting parts of the book, but the way the show treats it is 1,000 times more boring. At this point, there is nothing left of the American gods, and the show is slowly devouring itself. Charles Eglee's reign came with a lot of changes, and it seemed like he was actively trying to distance himself from the first and the second season.
Truth is, I'm exhausted. My recent brush with death and long haul of the campaign, I mean, where is the soul?
So he basically threw away everything that the first and the second season had for a fan-fiction-esque look at the source material and Norse mythology. The show at this point was something completely different and, if you ask me, something considerably worse. Maybe when your throat hurts, cold drinks aren't the best, but you know, I'm not going to learn that lesson here. A little bit of story again. So Shadow has learned that he is Wednesday's son and he's sent to Lakeside. In the book, it's because he's on a run from a shadowy organization and much of a god's plan is kind of a mystery to him. In the show, it's because Wednesday says something vague about a threat that really shouldn't exist because it was never established. On the other side of the coin, Lara is brought back to some literal voodoo magic, which had roots in the second season, and she goes to an afterlife scene which really doesn't make sense in this show, and then she goes out of her way to kill Wednesday, and she actually does it by finding another leprechaun because Matt Sweeney died at the end of the last season, and so she has the leprechaun bring her the Odin spear and she throws it at him. Also Danny Trejo. The big war between new gods and the old gods at this point doesn't really make any sense because it's not obvious what each side is trying to do. The old gods seem to go in a circle, not really advancing, and the new gods have some vague plan about how technology is bad. And we are going through some bullshit preachy stuff about how we need to, I don't know, go outside more. Which, I mean, it's COVID, we can't go outside. I mean, we can, but we have to wear masks. And people wear a mask. But that's just on the written side. How does the show look and feel? I think the best way of illustrating this point is to put the summit of the gods next to the gods gathering for Wednesday's corpse. Again, in the book, it's kind of like how it's in the show, but it doesn't make sense within the show itself if you don't know that it's an adaptation of a scene. And I'll get back to that later. But the summit had a bunch of gods, broken, but still proud. You know, as I said, it's kind of depressing, but epic. And when they're going to get Wednesday's corpse, there is two gods, Ibis and Chernobog. This is the war. And this is how the first season thought the war would go. This isn't war, this is defeat. The pathetic display of two gods walking Wednesday's corpse out of a motel and knowing all of the gods that we've seen so far, from Easter and Kali to Anansi and Anubis. And you see this and you can't help but see all of the problems that the show had outside of its universe in the real world about its production, seeping in and staining it like sewage. The show has been defeated, not the battle and the war in it, the show itself in a meta sense have been defeated. The show defeated itself from inside. There isn't much I can talk about season 3 that I haven't said already. Beside one interesting point, it's a fatal flaw of the adaptation, and I think it's something you need to be wary of. As I mentioned, the path of the show and the book have been diverging at this point, and so the events of the show and the plot was going in a very different direction. But the third season wanted to bring back the show into the way of the book, so they did it with a crowbar. I should have had a crowbar. I have a hammer, that hammer. But as the show has been diverging so far, it's a good place to bring some Norse mythology, maybe? Let's bring in Tyr, out of nowhere. And why not? Let's throw in a romance subplot with Demeter of all people. A love triangle between Wednesday, Tyr, and Demeter. For no reason other than to give humanity to a character which already had enough humanity when he was sitting alone singing after the death of his son. Okay, wait. That doesn't make any sense. Why? Why would you do that? Am I going crazy? Why is it so boring and long and doesn't make any sense? Am I finally broken? Did American God do what 7 seasons of Mentalist failed to do? Did I finally break? The show was going its own way. You didn't need to go to Lakeside. Because you did it only because it was in the book. But by that point, the events have changed. You had your own way. Why did you try to fit Lakeside in there? And why did the cast of the gods that were so diverse and interesting was suddenly all Norse gods and one Greek deity which doesn't make sense, and a bunch of African deities that again you weren't mentioning before, and I'll get to that. You see what I mean? By being broken, you see what I mean when I say Charles Eglee didn't understand the property he was given access to? Fuck me. Let's talk about Bilquis. I don't know whatever the show wanted to do with her and then forgot to do with her, but Bilquis started in the first season as the representation of love, as the deity who basically was our Eros, or love. And she had sort of an interesting idea. She was an old god that was brought on the side of the new gods and given a new identity. Basically, transforming her from one side to another and actually showing how the old gods can integrate themselves with the new gods and rule over mankind once again if they wish to do so. There are a lot of things like Mr. World saying in the first season that, oh, we're not going to do it, but Technical Boy doing it for Bilquis shows that there is ways. It's an interesting idea. And the second season actually gave way to that idea and expanded on it and gave it more thought, but she also had some preachy dialogue about how love is all good. Against Wednesday's shouts of war is the only answer, which I'm not really against, because it's crucial to remember the show's mission was to give more humanity to these deities, to these mythical creatures, to these mythical people, and they have to represent the domain, so it's logical and it makes sense within the universe of the show for these characters to have their own agendas and have their own beliefs when they are talking about what their domain is. And then in the third season, she has powers beyond her recognition and is apparently part of the African mythology. Okay, a bit of a confession. I can't say I know much about Yoruban mythology. I hope I'm not mispronouncing it. And apparently Belqis is an African goddess, a Yoruban spirit. But in my defense, it had never been an issue until season 3. Yeah, the show had wings for people who knew mythology, but you never were lost. I don't know much about African mythology, as I said, but I didn't have any problem understanding who Anansi was and what his agency was and what his powers were. And I don't know much about Indian mythology either, but I have no problem understanding who Kali was. How the show treats Belqis at worst shows a lack of care, which is a cynical view, or at best a lack of plan, which is what I want to feel like because I'm an optimist. I doubt originally they were planning for her to be a Yoruban deity, and if they did, they chose the worst way possible to show it. American Gods, up until season 3, wasn't a mystery box show. The intrigue of the show, the mysticism of it, wasn't because, well, not knowing what is going on, but understanding what is going on and anticipating the next step. The intrigue wasn't who are these, it's what is going to happen next with these characters. So suddenly Belqis has a completely different quest, new powers that we hadn't seen before, and her scenes honestly confuse me more than intrigue me. And now that the show is cancelled, it really emphasizes the lack of care that I mentioned, which is me giving way to the cynical way of viewing things. It's easy to write a mystery box. Anyone can do it. I can literally... This device has the power to summon a deity. Okay, 10 episodes from now, if the show goes on, do comment and I'll tell you who that deity is. If I learn how to do animation, I will animate it too. It's hard to write a good mystery that has the answer in and of itself with enough clues, but is still interesting. There is a reason a movie like The Usual Suspects tend to work really good even after you know the twist. With all of that said, that's how the show ended. A bunch of cliffhangers and no resolution to what we have seen so far. Salim had a very poor resolution to his arc. Anansi, Anubis, Easter, Kali, hell, even the Jinn, forgotten, gone. Mentioned in passing for some of them and not at all for most of them. So basically the third season was an independent organism. It introduced plot points in the first few episodes and then spent the rest of the season resolving the plot points that were introduced in the third season. And then there was this berserker who was portrayed by Marilyn Manson and they rushed to cut his scenes out, but by then I think an episode was aired, so they cut him out in the most awkward way possible. Which, wow. I mean, even if they showed him, I think that was a poor use of a mythical creature. Now, making a show is hard. It's really hard. There are so many things that can go wrong, and that's why when a show does good, we tend to praise it a lot because that means a lot of working cogs will work in accordance to create a unique experience. American Gods, on the other hand, feels like a clock where you pull the cogs out each season, fit different shape cogs, and expect it to run the same. So it feels like a mess. Because it was a mess. From behind the scenes drama to the actual execution of the show. There is a lot to be learned here from American Gods in how not to conduct the making of a TV series. And with that, it's over. Everything that was American Gods, the show, is left in the air, presumably to be forgotten unless by those who have a faint memory of it. How fitting. How poetic. And yet, how ironic. I want to finish this video by talking a little bit about the book. First of all, I'm going to do what I said I don't consider to be valid criticism and speculate. I think what the show did with the book was actually okay. I know for some people the act of defying a book is considered to be a sin, but as I said, I don't really mind it because it's a different medium. And honestly, what we were given wasn't bad. On top of that, the parts of the book that were faithful, they were done in a satisfactory way, even if the execution of the show left much to be desired. I think American Gods bothers me a bit too much, which means I've been talking about it for so long, is because I can see exactly where they went wrong. The show had its own path. It wasn't the same as the book, but it was different enough and interesting enough that it could stand on its own. But then they tried to drive it back into the route that the book had took. I think we could have had a good adaptation of American Gods. Yeah, it wouldn't be like the book, but it wouldn't need to be like the book. It's the faithfulness of an adapted piece of material is not what gives it value. Being faithful to the source material to the point of crowbarring or, hammering. Have you ever thought to yourself, what am I doing? Why am I hammering a book? Anyways, hammering the show's narrative into fitting the book, it can result in something that is arguably worse than what the show could be. I mean, for Christ's sake, look at Good Omens. As I said, rereading the book, I sort of realized why I would go over huge chunks of it like Cairo or parts of Lakeside and go to the parts that I really like the god who you couldn't remember in Las Vegas, or the Summit of the Gods in Odin's Head. The memory I have of the book is all of those good parts, and I sort of forgot that Lakeside or Cairo wasn't done in a good way. It's easy to think that Neil Gaiman created this flawless work of art and then it got botched when it got to Starz, but aside from that, it was ready and primed to be adapted. I don't believe that story. Gaiman was present during the show. He was planning the 4th season with Charles Eglee when the whole thing sort of collapsed. He actually did want to stick to the book even when the show had diverged and created its own separate path. It's one thing to be a good novelist. It's another to write a good motion picture. I still think American Gods is Gaiman's best work, one of his best work, and my favorite, and I do recommend it. But I didn't like watching the show because it had glimpses of book in it. I liked American Gods, the show, on itself. I think what kind of bugs me, and this is very petty, but I think what bugs me is that during all of this, Neil Gaiman was turned into a martyr that had his work butchered by those mean, greedy assholes at Starz, and nobody saw the hammer that he was holding when the whole thing crumbled down. I think it's unfair. It's unfair to Starz, it's unfair to Gaiman, it's unfair to the book, and it's unfair to the show. It's unfair to look at this to an idealized view of what it should have been and what it was. None of it was true. and having these idealized versions is really, at the end, just unfair. Overall, I think the show gave us enough good stuff that I tend to go back and look at. And it may have influenced and introduced the book, as it did for me, to a bunch of people who may have gone and read it and found a different version of the story that they also liked. It wasn't pointless until it was made pointless by trying to stick it to a narrative that didn't fit the medium it was being adapted to. And no matter what we think of it, it's still not Don Quixote. Okay, hear me out. Javier Bardem as Sancho. Now I know what you're thinking. Sancho, in all of its previous media adaptation, has been seen as sort of a bumbling fool, and I really dislike that idea because I think he's a very integral part of the Don Quixote experience. So I think we can make Sancho more of a sexual being. I mean, imagine it like this. We can take it even further. That was a long one. I hope you had fun watching the first TGTBTI, the good, the bad, and the interesting. And as I said, I have a lot more ideas for this show as to what happened. I have a notebook that I'm writing down all of the ideas, and they have fully fleshed outlines as well. I can't promise the next ones are going to be short. They might still be long, but I wanted to do one that wouldn't follow the structure of the other shows, and it would give me enough time to actually dive deep into the material that I'm talking to and really give it the time it deserves. I would love to hear your thoughts though. For those of you who have watched the show or have read the book, did you think I was misguided in my arguments? Or did you think I justified my arguments? Do tell me in the comments, and I do tend to answer as much as I can. For those of you who like to see me do this sort of show on any other art medium, comic books, book, TV shows, in particular intellectual properties, do tell me. And as I said, I have 10 shows planned, but I'm always willing to change that. And if I find the idea and there's enough ask for it, I will definitely put it in more of a express line. Well, as I said, this show has no set schedule, but I hope to see you on the next TGTBTI. If you like the video, please do share it, do like it, subscribe, bell, all of that. As I said, the show doesn't have any set schedule, so when it comes out, if you enjoyed it, you might want to see more of it. Holy shit, I forgot to talk about the new gods. Okay, the show really doesn't do much about them. They are just your usual faceless villains. The main one is Technical Boy, who is like the god of technology, who is this brat and not very good. The actor is actually really good, but the general idea, I don't know what they're thinking, and the show is cancelled, so it doesn't really matter. Then there is Mr. World, who, for you, those of you who have read the book, you know who he is. And he's played really good by Crispin Glover. He's supposed to be the new god of globalization. I don't understand how. But there's that. Then there is Gillian Anderson and some other actors. They were media and new media, which, I mean, it's in the name. You kind of know what they do. Oh, also, Danny Trejo also plays Mr. World, like another personification of him. And there is another actress too. I'm sorry, I should look this up. The worst part is even in my cheat sheets, I haven't written them. And there was Mr. Town, but they just kill him. They don't do anything with him. He's a big part in the book, and so they have to have him, I suppose, but it really doesn't matter. And a bunch of faceless ones that, again, doesn't really matter. Well, I hope to see you soon. Take care.